Mexico City is the fifth largest city in the world. Tragically, unlike Rome, Machu Picchu, Egypt, Athens, and many other historical sites, there's virtually nothing left of the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan, or the lake the city was built on, Lake Texcoco. The city was systematically dismantled, and the codices that recorded its people's history were burned. The famous pyramids of the Sun and Moon still stand, but those structures were in Teotihuacan, not Tenochtitlan. There are only a few places in Mexico today where you can see any structures from this once incredible city, which was home to around 250,000 people in 1521 when Hernán Cortés destroyed the city. Like Mexico City today, Tenochtitlan was one of the largest cities in the world. Happily, through modern technology, artist Thomas Cole brings us the city of Tenochtitlan as it appeared 500 years ago. The term Aztec is a modern invention. The people referred to themselves as the Mexica. Likewise, they did not refer to their empire as the Aztec Empire. It wasn't even an empire. What it was a group of 3 city-states, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, which allied against surrounding city-states. They called themselves Ixcantlatoloyan, or the Triple Alliance. The language they spoke is known as Nahuatl, and it is still spoken today by over 1 million people. While there are numerous written sources from the Mexica, most were recorded after European contact. For the sake of convenience, I will refer to the people of the Triple Alliance as the Aztecs, and their alliance as the Aztec Empire. I will do my best to refer to names of places and people as they would have said them. For example, Montezuma and Hernando Cortés were not their given names. They were Motecuazoma and Hernán Cortés. Also, these words are not pronounced Mexica or Texcoco, but rather Mexica and Texcoco. Some of these words are very difficult for me, but I will do my best. By the first millennium, cities like Teotihuacan emerged. Its influence stretched all the way down to the Maya, but began to decline around 550 CE, and nobody really knows why. After Teotihuacan, the Toltec Empire rose to power, ruling from Tula and drawing inspiration from its predecessor. Known for their artistry and speaking Nahuatl, the Toltecs became the dominant force in central Mexico before eventually collapsing, following the same path as Teotihuacan. Around 1300, the Tepanecs had become the dominant power in the Valley of Mexico, ruling from Azcapotzalco and controlling over 40 tributary cities. It was during this time that a new group, the Mexica, arrived from the northern deserts. Known as Chichimecas, or barbarians, they claimed to have come from a distant land called Aztlan. Initially, the Mexica were unwelcome in the crowded valley, seen as rough outsiders and forced to live as mercenaries. The Mexica settled on an uninhabited island on the western shore of Lake Texcoco. They built simple huts and an altar to their god Huitzilopochtli, marking the humble beginning of what would become Tenochtitlan. As the settlement grew, they expanded using chinampas, artificial islands created by staking out areas of the lakebed and filling them with soil. By the early 1400s, Tenochtitlan had transformed into a vibrant city connected to the mainland by causeways with drawbridges. The Mexica cultivated crops on their floating gardens and built a thriving economy based on farming, salt production, fishing, and even harvesting insects. Tenochtitlan had become a flourishing metropolis, rivaling some of the greatest cities in the world. By the early 1400s, Tenochtitlan had grown into a vast metropolis with over 200,000 residents, larger than London or Paris at the time. The city's rapid growth transformed the Mexica from nomads into a full-blown civilization. They embraced the cultural legacy of the Toltecs and Teotihuacan, mastered pyramid building, stone carving, and attracted skilled craftsmen and scholars. The city's infrastructure became impressive, with aqueducts supplying fresh water and a dam protecting against floods. Tenochtitlan was a city of luxury, boasting botanical gardens, a zoo, and an immense market in Tlatelolco, filled with goods from across the region: cacao, obsidian, and gold, among many other things. Moctezuma zoo not only housed plants and animals from all over Mexico, but people as well. Moctezuma seemed to have a curiosity for displaying people born with dwarfism and other physical disabilities, or those whose development led them to have misshapen limbs. In some accounts, the zoo is said to have been staffed by these individuals. Despite its grandeur and beauty, Tenochtitlan had a darker side. The pyramid in the Teopan district, with its shrines to Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, bore witness to the Mexica's belief in human sacrifice. They believed Huitzilopochtli needed hearts to continue the sun's journey across the sky, and the red shrine's blood-stained steps were a constant reminder of this ritual. The Aztecs are infamous for their human sacrifices, though they also sacrificed animals like jaguars, deer, and dogs. War prisoners were often brought to the pyramids, where priests cut out their still-beating hearts with obsidian blades as offerings to their gods. The bodies were thrown down the pyramid steps, sometimes fed to zoo animals, and, in some cases, partially consumed in cannibalistic rituals. While this practice is shocking, it wasn't unique to the Mexica. Many ancient American cultures practiced human sacrifice. Spanish conquistadors, however, exaggerated these rituals to justify their colonization, while the Mexica likely inflated their own numbers to showcase their power and intimidate the Spaniards. There were also accounts that were deliberately or accidentally fabricated, such as the idea that the Aztecs made bread out of sacrificed children that they consumed. This culture of sacrifice fueled the empire's expansion throughout the 15th century. The Aztec Empire functioned more as a network of tribute than a traditional empire. Instead of occupying conquered lands, the Aztecs extracted wealth from them, using a sophisticated system of roads and runners to maintain control. While most regions submitted, rebellion did happen and was brutally crushed. In particular, the independent Tlaxcalans suffered greatly, forced into ritualistic flower wars where warriors captured prisoners for sacrifice. The flower wars, like most Aztec battles, were not fought in the interest of killing enemies, at least not right away. The purpose was to capture enemies for human sacrifice. The skulls of captured and killed prisoners were displayed in Tenochtitlan. The cruelty the Aztecs inflicted, especially on the Tlaxcalans, bred deep resentment. Ironically, the same cruelty had led the Aztecs to overthrow the previous empire. Emperor Tlacaelel, the architect of Aztec expansion, died in 1487, having built an empire that spanned from coast to coast. Just 5 years after Tlacaelel's death, Columbus sailed across the Atlantic. The Aztecs, at the height of their power, could not foresee the catastrophe these newcomers would bring, signaling the end of their civilization. In the year 1502, Moctezuma II, the ruler of the mighty Aztec Empire, ascends to power. His coronation marked a new era, with Moctezuma standing as the ninth king of Tenochtitlan. At 35 years old, he was a figure of strength and vision. Those who knew him spoke of his quiet, commanding presence. But Moctezuma's reign began with more than just celebration. It demanded blood. As was tradition, after his coronation, he led campaigns to crush rebellions, bringing captives back to Tenochtitlan for ritualistic sacrifices. Meanwhile, far across the Atlantic, a very different story was unfolding in the small village of Medellin, Spain. Here, in the year 1502, a 17-year-old boy named Hernán Cortés was living a life that could not have been more removed from the grandeur of Moctezuma. Pale and frail from illnesses, Cortés was studying Latin in his quiet little home, much to the disappointment of his parents, who had hoped for a brighter future for their son. Though it was hard to imagine at the time, this irritable young man would one day play a central role in the downfall of the mighty Aztec Empire. Word of a brand new continent discovered by Columbus had reached Spain, and the stories of untold riches and lands waiting to be explored spoke directly to Cortés and his ambition. By 1504, Cortés had made up his mind. At the age of 19, he left Spain for the New World, sailing to the island of Hispaniola. After 2 months at sea, Cortés arrived. For the next several years, Cortés toiled in relative obscurity, slowly building up wealth. But his ambition was not yet satisfied. When Diego Velázquez, a prominent Spanish leader, prepared an expedition to conquer Cuba in 1511, Cortés joined. The campaign in Cuba was ruthless, marked by the violent suppression of the native people, and Cortés, though not a soldier, quickly rose in the ranks. His legal skills earned him the favor of Velázquez, who appointed him as his personal secretary, and later as the magistrate of Santiago, the newly formed capital. In 1517, an expedition ventured to the Yucatan Peninsula. This expedition discovered the grandeur of the Mayan cities, but suffered heavy losses in their encounters with local people. It was clear that this new land was unlike anything the Spanish had encountered before, perfect for an aspiring young man like Cortés. As rumors of the riches and challenges of this mysterious land spread, Cortés began to prepare for the next great chapter in his life. Soon, the ambitious young man from Medellin would set out on a journey that would change the course of history forever. In 1518, Diego Velázquez, now governor of Cuba, assembled a rescue mission to locate Juan de Grijalva, a Spanish explorer who had gone missing. Surprisingly, Velázquez appointed Hernán Cortés to lead the expedition, despite Cortés being only 33 years old and having very limited military experience. Nevertheless, Cortés recruited 300 men and prepared 6 ships for the voyage. However, just before they could depart, Grijalva returned. His stories of stone-paved cities, towering pyramids, and a powerful ruler named Moctezuma captivated the Spanish. But Velázquez saw this as a reason to cancel the mission. The danger seemed not worth it, and Velázquez and Cortés were rivals, and Velázquez did not want to give Cortés an excuse to climb up the ranks. Cortés, still driven by ambition, and perhaps his love of risk-taking, decided to go ahead with the expedition anyway, even against the governor's wishes. Before Velázquez could stop him, Cortés gave the order to set sail. With no supplies provided by the governor, they left Santiago on November 18, 1518. Legend has it that Velázquez rushed to the docks, shouting at Cortés, but the ships were already pulling away. Cortés, defiant, allegedly replied, "Forgive me, your worship, but some things are done, not debated." Short on food, Cortez's fleet sailed around Cuba, finding ports where they could secretly barter for provisions. Despite Velazquez's efforts to block their supply, Cortez gathered enough food and even convinced 200 men from Grijalva's expedition to join him. Now commanding 11 ships, 630 men, and equipped with horses, cannons, and mastiffs, they were ready to cross the waters to Mexico. What followed was the beginning of Cortez's invasion of Mexico. His letters to King Charles V are some of the most detailed accounts of the conquest, though they are written with an eye toward painting Cortez in the best possible light. Remember, he was deliberately disobeying orders. If he could make himself out to be the hero and the conqueror and to have brought riches to the king, that would be Hernan's way of avoiding any legal troubles. He masterfully justified his actions using his legal expertise, ensuring that everything appeared legitimate in the eyes of Spanish law. The Mexica people were well aware of the Spanish presence, although they were largely ignorant about the Spanish themselves, their customs, or their intentions. Lookouts stationed along the coast witnessed the strange white sails and sent word to Tenochtitlan that foreigners had arrived. Though European accounts later embellished the story, suggesting that the Aztecs believed the Spaniards were their gods, it's more likely that the Mexica quickly recognized the Spanish as powerful men from a distant land. Upon their initial meeting, the Mexica presented fine gifts of textiles, and the Spanish in turn gave simple beads. The first contact between the two civilizations set the stage for a monumental clash that would ultimately lead to the fall of the Aztec Empire. Moctezuma was deeply troubled by the accounts of foreign invaders. For years, rumors had spread about terrifying events in distant lands such as Hispaniola and Cuba. Always cautious, Moctezuma ordered the watchmen to return to the coast and maintain vigilance in case the foreigners came back. As the year drew to a close, word reached him that more ships had been sighted. Moctezuma sent a delegation to meet them. At the same time, Hernán Cortés and his fleet had made their way from Cuba to Mexico. After weeks of sailing, they encountered a shipwreck survivor, Geronimo de Aguilar, who had been living among the Mayans for 8 years after being shipwrecked off the Yucatan Peninsula on a missionary expedition. Aguilar's knowledge of the Mayan language made him a valuable asset, and he joined Cortés as a translator. Cortés's expedition soon clashed with Mayans at Pontochan, marking his first battle on Mexican soil. The Spanish cannons and firearms terrified the Mayans, who surrendered, offering gold and enslaved women as tribute. Among those women was Malintzin, a slave who spoke both Nahuatl and Mayan. Malintzin quickly became indispensable to Cortés, acting as a key translator alongside Aguilar. She played a crucial role in the expedition's success, her ability to communicate and navigate between different cultures making her a pivotal figure. Though her motivations remain unclear, her actions undoubtedly altered the course of history, as she aided Cortés in his quest to bring down the Aztec Empire. She would also bear him a son. It's not clear why Malintzin helped Cortés, but what is clear is she had lived a brutal and unjust life. She may very well have been motivated by revenge. With both Malintzin and Aguilar by his side, Cortés could now communicate with the Aztecs, which he used effectively to his advantage to bargain with them, to trick them, and eventually to conquer them. Cortés continued his voyage up the Mexican coast and finally chose a northern landing site. Without hesitation, he raided local villages for supplies and gold. Cortés knew his mission was a precarious one. He had defied orders from Governor Velázquez, and some of his men remained loyal to the governor. Legend has it that Cortez burned his ships upon making his final landing in Mexico. The idea was to prevent the possibility of any men from abandoning the mission, though he did keep one ship to send back to Spain with a letter and treasures for King Charles V, hoping to gain royal approval for his unauthorized expedition. The story of Cortez burning all but one of his ships is seriously doubted by some scholars. Cortez quickly established a settlement and named it Veracruz. Although it was little more than a few tents at the time, he set up a formal municipal council, effectively declaring himself the governor of the new town. This gave him legal authority to act in the name of the king, bypassing Velazquez entirely, who was the governor of Cuba, not Mexico. Not long after, emissaries from Moctezuma arrived, bearing gifts of gold and food, along with painters who would record everything, not in writing, but in pictures. Through the complex chain of translation involving Malinzin and Aguilar, Cortez met the messengers and, with cunning, claimed to be an ambassador of a king who ruled much of the world. He slyly mentioned that some of his men suffered from a disease that could only be cured by gold, prompting the emissaries to reveal that Moctezuma had plenty of it. The Aztecs valued gold, but mainly for ceremonial and decorative purposes. They may have been bragging about their gold the way a king brags about his marble floors. The idea of taking the gold as a form of currency made no sense to them, so they didn't realize that telling the Spanish they had large amounts of gold was catastrophic. This revelation sealed the empire's fate. It had to be conquered. Back at Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma pored over the detailed images brought back by his painters, depictions of the strange men, their weapons, and their horses. He grew increasingly anxious. The Spanish wore metal and had weapons, such as guns, the Aztecs struggled to even describe in words. They referred to their horses as large deer. Moctezuma attempted to be pragmatic. He sent spies to monitor the Spaniards' movements and asked other cities for information about the foreigners, but no one knew anything. The Spanish, however, already knew what they needed. They had learned that Moctezuma ruled in Tenochtitlan, that he had wealth, and more importantly, that he had enemies. This information was all Cortez needed to devise a plan to bring down the empire. Cortez set his sights on the Tlaxcalans, longtime enemies of the Aztecs. Knowing his 600 men wouldn't be enough to defeat Moctezuma's vast army, he sought alliances with the Tlaxcalans, who despised the Aztecs for years of oppression. On the 8th of August, 1519, Cortez marched inland toward Tenochtitlan with 300 men, leaving the rest behind in Veracruz to guard the coast. His journey through the tropical lowlands and up into the mountainous valleys was fraught with tension, but villages along the way offered maize, gold, and slaves to help transport the Spanish weapons. As they advanced, Cortez burned villages that resisted, including one with over 3,000 homes. He declared that their victory was a sign of divine favor, fighting for their faith with unshakable resolve. The conquest was in full force. As Cortez and his men reached the highlands, they encountered a desolate salt flat before the towering mountains surrounding the Valley of Mexico came into view. Food and water were scarce in this harsh landscape, but they eventually arrived in Tlaxcalan territory. Cortez expected a warm welcome, assuming the Tlaxcalans would be eager to join him in overthrowing Moctezuma. However, the Tlaxcalans, weary from years of conflict with the Mexica, mistook the Spaniards for enemies and mobilized their warriors. The Tlaxcalans attacked in waves, but their obsidian blades shattered against Spanish steel, while gunfire and cavalry charges devastated their numbers. Though the Tlaxcalans fought fiercely, they eventually retreated. Cortez had won, but he was shaken by the resistance and the losses his men suffered. If the Tlaxcalans could fight this hard, how could they hope to defeat the far more powerful Triple Alliance? After days of skirmishes and failed attempts at diplomacy, the Tlaxcalans finally settled for peace, explaining that they had mistaken the Spaniards for Motequesoma's allies. Word of Cortez's military prowess reached Motequesoma. Fearful of the Spaniards' power and now consolidation of power, Motequesoma sent envoys to Cortez, warning him not to trust the Tlaxcalans and inviting him to visit Tenochtitlan. Cortez, recognizing the deep division between the Tlaxcalans and the Mexica, saw an opportunity. He accepted the Tlaxcalan offer of friendship and spent weeks resting in their city. The Tlaxcalans, eager to settle scores with their rivals, pointed Cortez toward the city of Cholula, falsely claiming it was a close ally of the Mexica. Cortez, alarmed by the supposed threat, marched on Cholula. Upon arrival, the Spaniards were met peacefully by the Cholulans, but Cortez launched a surprise attack, massacring the city's inhabitants over 2 days and destroying a temple to Quetzalcoatl. Though Cortez later justified the massacre as a preemptive strike against a plot, it was more likely an act of terror meant to send a message to Motequesoma. When Motequesoma's messengers returned with news of the Spanish advance and the destruction of Cholula, the king was devastated. Nothing he had tried had stopped the Spanish advancement on his great civilization. The Tlaxcalan warriors and others who had joined the Spaniards marched closer, eager to exact revenge against their longtime enemies, the Mexica. In desperation, Motequesoma sent a servant disguised as himself to offer Cortez gold and gifts, hoping to appease the foreigners. But Cortez saw through the ruse, thanks to his Tlaxcalan allies, and continued to march toward Tenochtitlan. With the Spanish now crossing the mountain passes, panic spread across the empire. Entire towns emptied. As Cortez and his men descended into the Valley of Mexico, they were greeted by the awe-inspiring sight of Tenochtitlan, shimmering on Lake Texcoco. Approaching the causeways, they encountered Motequesoma himself. Motequesoma gave Cortez an Aztec calendar crafted onto a disc of solid gold. Cortez had the calendar melted down. This again displays the difference in the value of gold between the Aztecs and the Spanish. To the Aztecs, a piece of gold was worth something only insofar as it could be crafted into other things. Though gold jewelry did exist, to the Spanish, the only real valuable form of gold was raw or in the form of coins. After a brief exchange, the Spaniards were welcomed into the city. The date was November 8th, 1519. Motequesoma was one of the most powerful and successful rulers in Aztec history. Under his leadership, the empire reached its largest size. In his conquests, he had made many enemies, including the Tlaxcalans. As emperor, Motequesoma collected vast tributes of gold, crops, and slaves, enriching the elites of Tenochtitlan. Beyond his military achievements, Motequesoma was an intellectual who built a network of libraries, the zoo, and gardens, organizing everything from plants and animals to people across his empire. Though he was aware of the devastation the Spaniards had inflicted, Motequesoma was a proud and powerful leader in the most powerful city-state of the Triple Alliance. Like Atahualpa, he would more likely have been confident in his ability to dispatch the Spanish, if need be, than to kill them on sight. Whether his decision to be friendly with the Spanish at their first meeting was to lure them into a trap, convince them to ally with him to be an even more effective force in the region, or simply as a precaution, we will never know. It has also been speculated that Motequesoma believed the Spanish could serve as the opposition for the next flower wars, which were fought in a specific month of the Aztec year which was drawing near at the time Cortés made his way to Tenochtitlan. In his letters to King Charles, Cortés described a grand meeting with Moctezuma where they exchanged gifts, and Moctezuma supposedly proclaimed that he had been waiting for the Spaniards as prophesized conquerors. Upon meeting Cortés, Moctezuma effectively handed him the empire and surrendered without resistance, right then and there. This self-serving story, clearly tailored to impress the Spanish king, was widely published and helped transform Cortés from a mutineer into a celebrated conqueror. There is a letter supposedly written by one of Moctezuma's nephews that survives to this day. The letter confirms the narrative that Moctezuma welcomed Cortés as the rightful ruler who was handed the Aztec Empire, but there is a glaring problem. The letter is written in Latin. More than anything, this letter serves as evidence that the Spanish made up the surrender narrative. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar stationed in the Americas, was an avid and vocal critic of Cortés. Las Casas wrote extensive records of the atrocities committed by the likes of Cortés and believed the narrative of Moctezuma's surrender was fabricated by Cortés to justify the barbarism he acted with. Despite the myth that Moctezuma immediately surrendered to Cortés in 1519, there is very little direct evidence. The idea of his surrender comes primarily from Cortés's own account, written a year after the events, when the Spanish were struggling in their war against the Aztecs. As we will soon see, the conquistadors were on the verge of all being killed and losing everything they had fought for at that point. Cortés may have written the letter not just to lie to King Charles, but to lie to himself about what was really happening. There's also a persistent myth that Moctezuma thought Cortés was the god Quetzalcoatl. Cortés himself never once mentioned Quetzalcoatl in any of his writings, and this story was first written decades later. The Spaniards marveled at the grandeur of Tenochtitlan, but wasted no time interrogating Moctezuma about his treasures. The king handed over gold, jade, and other precious items, which the Spaniards melted down into gold bricks. Tensions escalated when news reached Cortés that some of his men had been killed at the coast. Seizing this as an excuse, Cortés accused Moctezuma of plotting against him. Despite the emperor's protest, he was taken captive, becoming a puppet ruler under the Spanish control. Moctezuma's fate was sealed as he was publicly escorted to the Spaniards' quarters, stripped of his authority. From that moment on, the once powerful ruler was emperor in name only, as the real power shifted to Cortés and his men. However, Cortés and his men understood the importance of keeping Moctezuma as a figurehead to maintain order and avoid an immediate uprising from the Aztec people. Moctezuma continued to perform many of his duties as emperor, including meeting with his lords, overseeing ceremonies, and issuing orders, but always under the watchful eye of the Spanish. The Aztec people initially believed that Moctezuma was voluntarily cooperating with the Spanish, though he had little real authority left. The Spanish used him to extract gold and resources from the empire and to keep the Aztec nobility and military leaders compliant. This strategy was extremely difficult, and as we shall see, collapsed in less than 1 year. Cortés was now controlling the Aztec Empire. One night, he arrested 17 Mexica lords, accusing them of plotting against his men in Veracruz. He burned them alive in the temple courtyard. Despite his imprisonment, the emperor maintained a dignified routine to keep up appearances, but Spanish guards followed him everywhere. In April 1520, Moctezuma secretly received a message showing 18 Spanish ships off the coast. Reinforcements led by a man named Panfilo de Narvaez, sent by Governor Velázquez of Cuba to arrest Cortés. Seeing an opportunity to rid himself of Cortez, Moctezuma communicated with Narvaez, providing routes and supplies. Fearing this secret plot becoming discovered, Moctezuma eventually revealed the approaching ships to Cortez, hoping to scare him away. Instead, Cortez exploded with anger, knowing he had to face Narvaez, but also realizing his forces would be dangerously divided. In May, Cortez left with 80 men, leaving the rest to control Tenochtitlan. Narvaez, confident with his 900 men, waited for Cortez. But Cortez, skilled in Mexico's terrain, launched a surprise nighttime attack, overwhelming Narvaez's forces. Narvaez was wounded and captured, and his men, promised gold by Cortez, quickly joined him. Meanwhile, in Tenochtitlan, Cortez had left Pedro de Alvarado in charge. On May 22nd, the Aztecs celebrated with a festival dedicated to the god Huitzilopochtli. In the middle of the festival, Alvarado and several men barricaded the exits and slaughtered countless unarmed Mexica. Accounts by the Aztecs write of the Spaniards beheading people, pulverizing their severed skulls into bits, chopping off limbs, and people stepping on their own entrails as they tried to run away after having been gashed by Spanish swords in the abdomen. There are different accounts of what happened. Some Spanish sources say Alvarado had learned that the Aztecs planned on rebelling and attacking the Spanish, so Alvarado struck first. The Aztecs, as well as some Spanish sources, say it was done so the Spanish could take the decorative gold worn by the Aztecs. If the Aztecs weren't planning a rebellion, they certainly were now. Aztec warriors counterattacked, and the Spanish, with their hostage Moctezuma, had to barricade themselves. Alvarado forced Moctezuma to plead with his people to stop, but they responded by pelting him with stones, signifying the end of his authority. It took 23 days for Cortez to return to the shores of Lake Texcoco, now leading a much larger force of 1,000 Spaniards and thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors. The Tlaxcalans knew that if they did not help the Spanish and the Aztec Empire was victorious, then they would suffer a wrath from them, the likes of which they had not yet seen. Upon arriving in Tenochtitlan, Cortez found a grim scene. The city was in open revolt. Inside the palace, Cortez reunited with Alvarado and his starving men, who greeted him with relief. Yet the danger remained. Crowds still gathered every day, assaulting the palace in rage. On June 30th, 1520, Cortez ordered Moctezuma to speak to his own people once again. Though reluctant after his first failed attempt, the emperor had no choice. From the palace terrace, Moctezuma addressed the silent crowd, urging them to surrender. But the crowd had turned on him. Stones and arrows soon rained down on the emperor, wounding him fatally. Moctezuma died the next day. It should come as no surprise, but there are different accounts of his death. Spanish accounts say he died as a result of being struck in the head by a rock. Some accounts claim he was hit by an arrow. There was a version of the story told by the Mexica that is wildly different. They claimed Moctezuma was already dead when he addressed the crowd. The Spanish had impaled him on a pole and propped up his body in an attempt to literally use him as a puppet. Other accounts claimed that after he was stoned by his own people for a second time, the Spanish stabbed him to death, seeing that he was no longer useful. While this account is contended, what is not contended is that the Spanish did stab to death all of the other leaders from the surrounding city-states that were also being held in the palace. With Moctezuma dead, Cortez knew his hold on the city was lost. The Mexica had learned to exploit the city's geography, using canals and rooftops to launch relentless attacks. Cortez hatched a desperate plan to escape the city at night. attempting to sneak out under the cover of darkness. The Spanish packed as much of the stolen gold as they possibly could onto their horses and fled. However, somebody spotted them and raised the alarm. The Mexica quickly mobilized, attacking the Spaniards with arrows and war canoes. The Spanish were at a disadvantage in the narrow streets and canals, and chaos ensued. Many were killed, including 600 Spaniards and thousands of Tlaxcalans. Their gold sank into the lake as they fled. Cortés survived, but he was humiliated and defeated, and he vowed he would destroy Tenochtitlan. Cortés retreated to Tlaxcala, where he spent months gathering reinforcements, including a vast native army and 12 ships. By Christmas 1520, he returned to Tenochtitlan with 100,000 native allies, 900 infantry, cavalry, cannons, and launched a deadly siege on the city. Cortés slowly choked the life out of Tenochtitlan, aided by the spread of smallpox, as his ships and blockade tightened their grip on the once great city. They systematically destroyed blocks of the floating city, shrinking the ground where the Mexica would make their final stand. After weeks of siege, Cortés gave the order to advance onto Tenochtitlan. The battle was intense and relentless, as the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies fought house by house, with heavy casualties on both sides. As the fight dragged on, Cortés resorted to drastic tactics. He ordered the destruction of each district, filling the canals with rubble to hinder the Mexica canoes. Despite their resistance, the Mexica were slowly being crushed. They even managed to destroy several of Cortés's ships. However, famine and disease soon devastated the Mexica. Because the city was literally an island, the Spanish from outside the city were able to completely stop the import of new supplies. The Spanish further cut off their water supply, forcing the Mexica to drink from the salty lake. Eventually, the Mexica made their last stand in the market of Tlatelolco. Surrounded and outnumbered, the Mexica surrendered on August 13th, 1521. Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, was captured, and the Aztec Empire was no more. Cortés, humiliated by his defeat and the destruction of the city he wanted to present as a jewel to his king, set about erasing Tenochtitlan from history. The surviving Mexica were enslaved and forced to demolish their own city, building European structures over the ruins. Cortés ensured the culture and memory of the Aztec Empire were systematically erased, replacing their great temples with churches. Tenochtitlan became Mexico City, and the lake it once stood on was drained and paved over, leaving no trace of the mighty city that had once ruled the valley. It seems that even revenge wasn't good enough for Hernán Cortés. He could have easily retired rich and famous, but he spent the later years of his life chasing glory. His own ambitions ended up bankrupting him, and he died in Seville, Spain in 1547.